Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. And this is episode 60 of Generation Jihad. Today, I'm going to introduce my friend and colleague at Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Dr. Jonathan Schanzer. He's a senior vice president for research at FDD and author of the recent book, Gaza Conflict 2021. Say hello to everyone, John.
Hey, Bill. Hey, everyone.
John, before we get started, and today we're gonna be talking about Iran, its proxies, the status of the nuclear talks, and sanctions, things of that nature. Before we get started, I want to tell everyone a quick story. My first meeting with John Schanzer and Mark Dubowitz. This was May 2010 when they recruited me to join Foundation for Defense of Democracy. I live in southern New Jersey, but my family's from South Philadelphia. John is a Philadelphia area native as well. And correct me if I'm wrong, John, but you and Mark were going to be in Philly, and Mark wanted to get cheesesteaks, right? So we had to go down to South Philly and go to not just Pat's or Geno's. We had to go to both Pat's and Geno's.
Well, just to be clear, if you're going to go to one, you got to go to the other. And if you're with someone else, you just cut your cheesesteak in half at each place, and you can, settle that age-old debate of which one's better. You can try.
And it was at that moment, I don't really think there was a hard sell for you guys at that moment. I was like, wow, these guys understand Philadelphia. And let's do this. And I've been a fellow at FDD now. It's coming up on 12 years. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you all for supporting my work. And thank you for John for being a great friend and a great colleague over these years.
It's my pleasure. Long War is just a great product, and it's consistently put out tremendous research. And I think it's been invaluable to the analytical community. By the way, I'll just note that as long as you're telling Philly stories, that Mark and I came back and invited Bill to a Flyers game. We had these beautiful seats. I mean, they were, I want to say it was probably 3 or 4 rows behind the visiting goalie, first and third period. So you could watch the Flyers on, offensive rushes and everything. And Mark Dubowitz is Canadian born. And he was cheering for the other team. I want to say
Capitals.
Was it the Caps?
Okay.
Yeah,
it was.
Yeah. I was going to say it might have been the Leafs, because I know at some point he was more of a Leafs fan. But at any rate, he's cheering when the other team scores. And if you know Philadelphia, the sports fans don't take kindly to that. And Mark was, I would say, maybe a minute or two from getting smacked around a little bit by a couple of angry, potentially inebriated fans. And that was when Bill stepped in, made his presence felt, and kind of snarled at these other Philly fans. He said, look, I don't agree with him either, but you got to stand down. And I think it's at that point that Mark realized how valuable Bill was to the organization.
Yeah, I'll take that. No one messes with my company, John. I think, as you know, that's you're gonna look. I've gone to football games, Eagles games with Cowboys fans wearing Cowboy jerseys. So I've survived this long. I'm not going to do that ever again. But if you could do that in the 700 level in Philadelphia, you can. I think I think that's what the reason why I was kind of comfortable doing embeds with the U.S. military in Iraq and Afghanistan. I probably
you're trained.
I was born in fire, so
Well, I'm just going to say, episode 61 could be on just the dangers of being a Philly sports fan.
Exactly.
If you want it, I'll come back.
Yeah, I think that is definitely borderline terrorism at certain points, but but that's
my kid thinks so. By the way, just being a Philly fan, at one point during the pandemic, after the Eagles were terrible, he looked at me. He's like, "Dad, why do you keep doing this to me?" As if he's enduring a horrendous hardship. So yeah,
it's we bear our crosses as Philly fans, but get the occasional once in a decade or so championship. Well, look, let's get to it, John. So Iran is back in the news. The Biden administration is trying to renegotiate a nuclear deal with Iran? Are they going to revive the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA as it's called? Is it going to be JCPOA light? Or is it going to be something else? So John, what is the current status of the Biden administration's talks with Iran? Do we think it's going to be a full revival, a partial revival, or is this going to be something else?
So I think we don't know. What we can say is maybe it's probably helpful just to review the facts for just a quick second. 2013, the United States announces an interim deal where we start throwing fairly sizable sums of money at Iran per month just to stay at the negotiating table. That culminates in a process in 2015 where the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, is announced. And it's basically temporary restrictions on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for more than $150 billion, according to some estimates, and basically letting Iran off the hook on every other activity that it's involved in terms of destabilizing the region, supporting terrorism, et cetera, human rights violations. And so that was what reigned until 2018. That's when Trump pulls out of the deal, which he called the worst deal ever. Of course, he read every one of those pages. We know he must have really been a student of that deal. I am being a little facetious. But at any rate, he leaves and there's nothing else in place. And so we've been kind of in limbo for the last several years. The Trump administration put on significant sanctions. They called it maximum pressure. It dropped Iran's accessible cash reserves to under $10 billion, which is no small feat. That's pretty as close as you get to bankruptcy as a country. And yet somehow Iran survived. I think there are interesting counterfactuals to put out there about whether the regime would have survived another 4 years of Trump. I tend to think that it probably wouldn't. But at any rate, when Biden comes in, he made it clear that the goal was to resurrect the deal. This was a legacy foreign policy issue for him and, of course, for former President Obama and a number of people who've come back to join the administration. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, Antony Blinken, the current Secretary of State, Rob Malley, the current envoy for the deal. And so Malley is the guy that's really running point on this, and he's doing everything that he can. It really looks obsequious. It's almost embarrassing what he's trying to throw at the Iranians right now to entice them to come back into compliance with the deal. The Iranians have a new president, Ibrahim Raisi, who's a bit more of a, let's just say he's probably not interested in talking to the United States as much as previous Iranian regimes have. I think there's a real danger, by the way, in talking about moderates and hardliners. Anybody that works for this regime, anybody that represents this regime is, in fact, a hardliner, no matter how you phrase it. This is a murderous regime that supports terrorism and oppresses its own people. But at any rate, the goal has been to try to bring Iran back. The regime doesn't appear terribly eager, and it looks as if they are trying right now to get into a lighter version of the deal, where there will be probably greater sanctions relief and more perks for the regime in exchange for fewer restrictions on the nuclear program. There was a time where they talked about getting a longer and stronger deal. That talk's long gone. So now it's kind of a more for less, is how Mark Dubowitz puts it. We give them more, they give us less. That looks like where we're headed. But of course, that all depends on whether the regime is willing to get back to the table. And then maybe the last other thing to note here is that you got Republicans who are, openly saying that unless this thing's a treaty, it ain't going to last. That there's no way that, if a Republican president comes in, that they're going to countenance this thing again. It was so flawed the last time around. It'll be flawed this time around. So beware Iran, beware international community, beware international businesses. If you start working with Iran, it won't last. And so, I think you have a lot of competing narratives here and some clashes over this. I personally think it would be a big mistake for us to get back in. but it's interesting, there still is a debate, and there's an echo chamber coming certainly from the White House and others that are big proponents of this. It's amazing to me. I'm not sure how they think this is going to play out in any other way, but that Iran pockets all the money and then walks away with nukes. That is, I think, the game plan for the Iranians. And it's amazing to me that the proponents of this deal can't seem to acknowledge that that's almost certainly where Iran wants to take it.
Yeah, John, you mentioned that this deal, you said the previous deal, right, was the worst deal ever. It sounds like this would be the worst deal ever. I can't understand where, again, this is obviously my opinion, but how do policymakers think that handing Iran money to delay building its nuclear program is in the United States' best interest? This is just utter insanity. And do you think the other thing that you mentioned in here is our schizophrenic foreign policy, right? One administration signs a deal, the next administration cancels it, the next administration comes in, is going to sign a deal, this is just no way to conduct foreign policy. I think this really represents the end of a unified foreign policy within Washington. And we saw this with, Afghanistan, that was a unified foreign policy. Both Republicans and Democrats wanted to end. The only criticism we've seen of Afghanistan has come when, after the fact, when it's become politically expedient to do so.
Yeah, I'll just say this, that the first thing to note is that you're right. We used to have a more centrist foreign policy. It used to be that Democrats and Republicans were equally focused on, the Soviet challenge, the Soviet threat. And you didn't see a lot of whiplash between Democrats and Republicans. You might have the occasional, Nixon to China type initiative, Reagan pulling out Star Wars, where there were initiatives within the kind of general framework of what our foreign policy would be. I would say that Iran represents the first, but certainly not the last, of these whiplash foreign policies where you see significant changes from one administration to another. And it is real cause for concern. I think, you can see the partisanship beginning to creep in to what was normally, within the 40-yard lines in American discourse. And now all of a sudden there's severe, sharp disagreements between parties. And I think it's a problem. And by the way, it's a problem that our allies and our enemies all acknowledge. Right. Our allies are saying, look, I remember actually going and meeting with some senior folks, I'll just say in a Gulf country. And they said, look, we respect your democracy, but you're killing us with how you're going back and forth between one president and another, one administration and another on your Iran policy. How the hell are we supposed to keep up with your politics and your insanity? This is driving us crazy. But then the other part of it is, like, you think about a country like Israel, right? And here, they went from completely furious about the Obama administration giving their arch enemy billions of dollars and giving them a patient pathway to a nuclear weapon. Then Trump comes in, right? He just wipes it all off. And they're like, oh, this is awesome, right? We love this. But then, of course, then Biden comes in and they're like, nope, we're going back into the deal. And the Israelis are like looking at each other, like, how are we supposed to navigate this stuff? And it's hard. And so the politics that we're seeing in America, this very sort of hyper partisan era, is having an impact on our adversaries and our allies. By the way, when I talk about our adversaries, the Iranians almost certainly waited out Trump, knowing that if somebody, if Biden came in or a Democrat came in, that they'd be saved. And that's just, I think, not a good precedent for policymaking.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think we saw the origins of this with the Iraq War, right? You had most of the Senate, if nearly all of the Senate, votes for it, and then within 2 to 4 years, turns. Actually, within 3 years, turn on it. And I think once at that point, the disagreements in foreign policy, the politicization, the hyper partisan politics when it comes to foreign policy. That's really where it drew in. And then it's just become, we've seen this in theater after theater, that we're dealing with. I'm going to just make two quick comments and then, move on to the next question. You had mentioned moderates. There's no such things as Iranian moderates, right? That are involved in the government. We have a lot of, we have a lot of experience with this when it came to Afghanistan, right? Everyone was looking for the moderate Taliban, trying to, it seems like, I think this
lowercase t, man, right? There's the capital T and the lowercase.
Right. And then
lowercase are the moderates.
And right? They all form a government, and the guys that everyone wanted to say were moderates really or just got on board and signed on and took lesser roles. So I think we really saw what the value of the moderates were. We just seem to be in search of our foreign policy establishment. Ourselves, those of us at FDD and in several other places excluded, seem to be in a constant search for moderates, and it's corrosive to our foreign policy.
What's interesting though is I would even argue now that I think they've given up. Here in the United States, I mean, you don't really hear folks talking about it a whole lot anymore. Even the people that are apologists for the Iranian regime and are talking about getting back into the deal, they're not talking about moderates anymore. They're just saying, like, we just need to do it, guys. Shut up and listen to us. That search for that eternal search for moderation in the Middle East is, I think, given way to what we describe as neo-isolationism, which is like, this is just a sinkhole. We're never going to get anything out of being in the Middle East. We can't find moderates, so let's get out entirely. Let's stop trying to shape the battlefield.
Yeah, and there's a certain element of subservient foreign policy as well. It seems like we seem to enjoy, not you and I, but the establishment in Washington seems to enjoy subjugating themselves to evil regimes, to the Taliban, to the Iranians, the Iranian regime. And I just, I find that repulsive myself. I'm tired of watching this. It really starts to wear on my soul.
Well, it's worked out so well in history,
right.
Bill. I mean, really.
It really has. And one final comment, Mali, is he the Afghan equivalent of Zalmay Khalilzad, the guy who's out there?
I would argue yes. And actually, just a little bit of news. I don't know if this is something that anybody can substantiate, but the Javad Zarif, the former foreign minister of Iran, just came out and said that that I guess that one of the original plans for the JCPOA was actually that if the Iranians provided it, I guess, to the crisis group, which is where Mali used to work. So he was basically inferring that there was some sort of collusion between the Iranian regime and Mali when he worked for this nonprofit, and now he's in this position where he has immense influence on whether or not a deal will be struck. So some cause for concern there.
Yeah, absolutely. We have it's very similar questions about Khalilzad and his dealings in Afghanistan, but ultimately what we know, what they're doing, what they're advocating for is bad for our national security. And so that takes me to the next question. If a deal is done, and I think it's safe to assume we don't think it will be beneficial to the United States and to our allies and partners in the region, how will this deal ultimately impact the Middle East and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as the joke goes, it's really hard to predict anything in the Middle East, let alone the future. But what I would just say is that it's almost certainly going to lead to some sort of nuclear race, right? That if Iran does acquire, a nuclear weapon, then what's to say that the Saudis won't want one, or the Emiratis, or the Jordanians, whoever, right? I mean, there's, the Egyptians, for that matter. There could be a range of countries that may want to go down that path as well. And I think a Middle East that's already been highly unstable, that has more than the existing number of nuclear powers, declared or undeclared, is bad enough. So I just think that it's it's something that we all need to watch out for. But the other thing to point out here is that a lot of people kind of look at the Iranian nuke as, okay, they want to annihilate Israel, or they want to annihilate Saudi Arabia. That may be true. Okay, we can stipulate that may be one of their goals. But really, one of the major concerns is that it will be the ultimate insurance policy for the Iranian regime to do whatever the hell it wants to do in the Middle East, right? So if it's Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, if it's Hamas, it's Hezbollah, it's precision guided munitions, it's whatever the heck they want to do, their ultimate answer when challenged by the United States, the United Nations, of course, that probably won't happen, but let's just say in a fictional world, the UN actually does confront Iran. I mean, their answer is like, you guys can go pound sand. We've got a nuke and you can't tell us what we can and can't do. And that's the concern, is that, no one will be able to hold the regime accountable any longer if it gets that nuclear weapon. And so that's one to watch. But suffice it to say, the Middle East will not be any more stable as a result of a deal that ultimately legitimizes aspects of Iran's nuclear program and allows them at some point in the future to build on what they have and ultimately break out.
No, it's an excellent point. The nuclear umbrella for Iran would certainly allow it to double down on its operations throughout the Middle East. Who's going to take?
I mean, let me ask you. I mean, we've seen this before with Pakistan. Right. I mean, has anybody been able to hold Pakistan to account for anything that it's done? I mean, you follow this file really closely. Have we ever been able to hold Pakistan to account for any of its shenanigans around the region since it's gone nuclear?
Yeah, absolutely, John. That is a great analogy. So, yeah, and the answer to that is no. The United States actually has been fearful of dealing properly with Pakistan. The U.S. officials have known for 2 decades now that the Pakistanis have been double dealing with the U.S., taking our money, funding the Taliban, and then killing American troops while the U.S. was there. And the Pakistan has won in Afghanistan and will never pay a price for that. And a big part of that was because U.S. officials feared Pakistan's nuclear weapons, not being the target of them, but nuclear weapons falling in the hands of jihadists, a nuclear war breaking out between Pakistan and India, things of that, or Pakistan distributing nuclear technology to terrorist groups or other countries. Oh, by the way, which it did with North Korea, right, with AQ Khan. So, yeah, it's a great point. I mean, that's that nuclear umbrella that will sit on top of Iran if it's allowed to happen. And what country is going to take a risk to kill the next Qasem Soleimani, right? Like, we're able to do that now. But who is Israel really going to risk a nuclear confrontation with Iran, and take that risk to target key individuals? These are the things, these are the implications for Iran. And the other thing I think that's key here, what do U.S. allies and and partners in the Middle East start doing? Do they start looking elsewhere, looking for a more reliable ally? Is it time to cozy up with Russia or with China because we're tired of America's schizophrenic foreign policy, which led to a nuclear Iran, and we can't trust the United States anymore? This is a major concern of the erosion of American, not just the hard power, but the soft power here. And that.
Well, I'll tell you, there are a couple things to watch. I mean, look, there's the negative possible consequences, which we can get into. But what's really interesting is that the fear of America's departure from the region, the fear of American errant foreign policy actually led a number of the Gulf states and Israel to make peace in 2020. And that was a positive thing, right? It was where they said, you know what? I mean, screw this. If America's not going to be here to help us, then we better help ourselves. Right, and create an alliance of sorts where they can share intel and potentially cooperate on whatever it is, cyber, military, you name it, right? But then there's the other part of it, which I think you rightly raise, which is if the region truly feels like it's been abandoned, that the United States is empowering Iran, and by the way, leaving. Because, as we discussed, there's this perception that it's a sinkhole for American dollars and for American soldiers, and why bother? You can't fix it; it's broken, right? That's the perspective. So between that and the United States handing over power to the arguably the most destructive force in the region, the Islamic Republic of Iran, how long before Russia expands beyond, for example, where it is right now in Syria? I mean, if anything, Putin demonstrated to the Russians, but also to much of the Arab world, he's not leaving. He's going to fight for his clients. How many others can he win over if he stays the course? The Chinese could care less about human rights, could care less about democratization. They could care less about all the demands that the United States has traditionally placed on its allies in the region. And so you can imagine the Chinese being able to waltz in there as well. So I think a lot of concerns you rightly raised.
Yeah. And this is a world where the Russians and Chinese are now able to, look, they're nowhere near our capacity, but they're able to before thinking that the Chinese could project power into the Middle East or Africa, that was, you would have laughed at that in the 1980s, 1990s, but not today. The Chinese are building a credible navy. They've shown that they're willing to invest in countries. Russians have intervened in Libya and in Syria, and they've shown that they're willing to see these things through. These are things the United States, the way we're acting. You make a great point about the human rights. I'm going to just make a real quick point, because you had said it's impossible to predict anything in the Middle East, particularly the future. But remember both with the Abraham Accords and with moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, right? Everyone's the Arab streets going to explode. This is going to be the end of regimes. Well, none of that happened. So it is very, very, as you note, very difficult to predict what the consequences of something are. But I do think a nuclear armed Iran will not result in positive outcomes for the region. I just can't, I can't game one out, John.
Yeah, I think you really went out on a limb there, Bill. No, but it's Occam's razor, right? The simplest explanation often is, I think the best way forward in terms of trying to predict what might happen. You throw an empowered, enriched, terrorist sponsoring state into the mix that happens to also be either on the cusp of a nuke or already has one. It's not going to end well. It should be pretty obvious to policymakers. Somehow, these guys, they're doing mental gymnastics to try to convince the policy-making community, the international community, that this is the safest way forward. And I just simply don't get it.
No, I don't either. They're impressing ultimately, and I saw this with Afghanistan. They're viewing our enemies or adversaries the way we wish they are instead of the way they actually are. And I think this is a massive failure. We did, I hate to keep going back to Afghanistan, but that's so close and it's over now, right? And we could point to that and say, look, we could dissect this. We wanted the Taliban to be moderate. We wanted the Taliban to join an Afghan government. We wanted the Taliban to disassociate with Al Qaeda, except the Taliban was never going to do any of those things because the Taliban didn't agree with us. So when you start deluding yourself into believing your enemy is something that it isn't, that it holds views that it doesn't hold, you are destined for failure.
And by the way, I'll just add to that, when you find middlemen, brokers, interlocutors that you rely on to kind of help you get there, and they are also not moderate. And here, of course, I'm referring to our friends in Qatar.
Yes.
They did not have our best interests at heart. I think they were advocates for the Taliban. And when you kind of look at what's happening now with some of these negotiations with Iran, look, the Russians are involved. Right. The French are involved. I'm not saying the French are the Qataris, but I also would say that they're not necessarily thinking about, our best interests. Their record here has been spotty, right? I think it's important to look at the big picture.
Yeah, don't get in the way of the French and their big business. And their overseas oil interests and things of that nature.
Yeah, don't get in the way of ours either. But I think we still have some controls, right?
All right, we'll take a quick break. I'm Bill Raggio, Senior Fellow, Foundation for Defense of Democracies, editor of FDD's Long War Journal, and host of Generation Jihad. We're joined today by Dr. Jonathan Schanzer. He's the Senior Vice President for Research at FDD and author of Gaza Conflict 2021. Buy your copy. We're talking Iran. It's the nuclear deal, or the next nuclear deal, what this means for the Middle East. And now we're going to move on and talk about one of my favorite subjects, Iran's. I know everyone thinks I'm Afghanistan and Sunni jihadist, but I've done a lot of work on Iran's proxies and Iran's support for terrorist organizations. And so this one's near and dear to my heart. And in a strange way. So, John, everyone's aware. Everyone in this field, they're aware of Iran's support for Hezbollah, the threat it poses to the United States, to Israel, the world. It's conducted attacks in South Africa against Jewish interests. But Iran has supported a wide array of militias, and we're going to discuss a couple of them today. Obviously, we'll go over Hezbollah and what's going on with that. Hamas, another premier proxy of the Iranian and a thorn in the side of the Israelis. And then we'll look at the Iraqi militias as well as the Houthis, which are in Yemen, which I actually think is one of the most successful militias being supported by Iran right now. So first,
I agree.
Yeah,
I'd say let's tackle that one because honestly, I think that's the story right now.
Let's do it. Let's flip the script. Let's go with Hezbollah, John. So
yeah. Look, I'll just say with the Houthis. I wrote a piece with our colleague Matt Zweig for the Journal. I got to say, I don't know about you, but I am so frustrated with the administration's policy on the Houthis. This isn't a partisan thing. This is about straightforward counterterrorism policy. I mean, for those who maybe just want a quick refresher, the Trump administration with one of its last days decided to designate the Houthis, put them on the sanctions list at the State Department, the Foreign Terrorist Organization list. They did it without consultation with the incoming administration, which is kind of a no-no. I know everybody's shocked to hear that the Trump administration was not up on norms, but
who would have thought?
So yeah, exactly. So so they did it, and it didn't go over well. But when you look at the criteria for the Houthis, they are a terrorist organization. There's no doubt about it. The bombings of Saudi Arabia, the killing inside of Yemen itself, the asymmetric warfare that they engage in, there is no doubt that they meet the criteria. But yet, the Biden administration comes in and they delist the group, take it off the list within days, citing the need to get aid into Yemen, saying that if you designate the Houthis, we're not going to be able to do this. Well, look, I'll just say we have had sanctions on other terrorist groups in other jurisdictions. I think about Hamas that controls the Gaza Strip. We've got sanctions on the Assad regime in Syria. How about the Taliban? Right. And you're still able to get aid into Afghanistan. Of course, we had troops there to help make sure that things were flowing. But, I'm sure you could probably name a handful of other places where sanctions have been in place. I don't know.
Well,
got one off the top of your head?
We've listed the PKK or the Kurdistan Workers Party as a terrorist organization, and yet we support them while they're fighting the Islamic State in northern Syria. So, we find ways around this, but to me, it always define your enemy, right? Define them. And I completely disagree with our policy with regards to the SDF or PKK. But if the U.S. wants to do something, if it wants to move aid or move support, it could do so. But there's no reason to delist. And one of the things that really bothered me with the delisting is the administration or the State Department said the Houthis act like a terror. I'm paraphrasing here. They listed all the reasons why they were designated and basically said, yeah, this acts like a terrorist organization, but we're not going to call them that because we need to be able to get aid in there. It was the most.
And I'll tell you what got me even more was that we've seen statements put out by the State Department since then, where they're like, the Houthis are actually preventing aid from getting into the country. Right. And then every time there's a terrorist attack, whether it's against the Saudis, whether it's against the Emiratis, they come out with these statements condemning a terrorist attack against a group that has been delisted as a terrorist organization. Go figure. It's like, again, we're twisting ourselves in knots here for reasons that I don't quite get. And some people think, by the way, that there's been a fear of designating the Houthis or keeping them on the list because they want to try to keep channels open with the Iranians for nuclear negotiations, that this might have been a concession of some sort. I don't know if that's true, but certainly, it smells a little bit like appeasement.
No, you wouldn't appease the Iranians. Delist Hezbollah. The Houthis, seriously, is that going to catch the eyes of the Iranians? Is there a channel there between, that's...
but lawmakers will not put up with Hezbollah. I think it's too obvious, right? With the Houthis, I mean, most people can't point to Yemen on a
Right.
map, man. I mean, they don't know what's going on there. You say the Houthis, they don't even know what that means, right? I mean, then you use their name Ansar Allah. Maybe it sounds closer to Hezbollah, but yeah, I don't. Most people, again, not up on this, which I think is as allowed the administration to keep its current policy in place. But they're feeling the heat now after some of those attacks against Saudi and some of those attacks even more recently against the UAE.
Yeah, and when just another irony here. The timing of this stuff is, listen, if I didn't, have dark humor, I'd have none whatsoever. But I remember they were delisted. And then within days, the Houthis conducted an attack that the State Department, condemned. I mean, and, for all of the reasons. And it's just sitting here and watching this, they're just playing you for fools. The Houthis State Department, they're playing you for fools. It's almost like they're doing this to stick it in your eye. And, people, the Houthis control more than half of Syria. They control the capital.
Yemen.
I'm sorry. Yemen. My bad. They control half of Yemen.
If they controlled half of Syria, real trouble.
That is true. We really would. Yeah. They really would be the most underrated Iranian proxy in that case.
They would be.
I mean, it's launching ballistic missiles at the UAE currently. We've had to deploy aircraft and anti-ballistic missiles and warships. This is a terrorist regime, and our response to this is just shameful, and it shows how unfair
it has been. Oh, it really does, and it undermines the integrity of our sanctions regime. As a former Treasury guy, I got to say, you got to stick to the letter of the law. When something meets criteria, you can't delist it for political reasons. By the way, delisting set a terrible precedent for other terrorist groups that may try to get themselves delisted. IRGC, for example, you mentioned Hezbollah. I think that's a long shot, but I could imagine other groups, some of the Shiite militias that you have tracked at Long War Journal in Iraq and Syria, they may try to get those delisted. The ones that are on the list anyway. And so I think it's a huge problem. But you also have to remember that there is an attempt here. There's a political element to this, which is that the Biden administration kind of has it out for the Saudis.
Right.
And so the delisting of the Houthis was kind of a finger in the eye of the Saudis, saying, look, you guys killed Jamal Khashoggi, and you've waged a pretty sloppy war in Yemen. And so, you know what, we're going to do this and, eat it. It was kind of, I think, the message that they were sending to the Saudis. I got to say, really short-sighted, really messy at this point. You see the Houthis only growing stronger. You mentioned the attack right after the delisting. I looked at some data suggesting that the number of attacks have actually doubled since the delisting. So in other words, not only has the delisting failed to allow for the provision of aid in the country, but it's actually also prevented even a step towards reconciliation in the country, which I think has been the ultimate goal, right? Dialogue leading to some kind of peace. But the Houthis, I mean, it feels like they're more and more under the thumb of the Iranians. The weapons, the training, the cash, it's all flowing. By the way, thanks to a headquarters in the country of Oman that nobody talks about. That should be another issue that, the Omanis should be, just getting knocked around for it. But we're not even calling them out. We're saying, oh, sure, let's host some dialogue in Muscat or something. So it's complicated, but it's been, I would say, a failed policy there.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be clear to our listeners, the attacks we're talking about that John's talking about that have doubled, we're talking attacks against civilian targets outside of Yemen, into attacks against the airport in the UAE was one of the most recent ones, against Saudi oil facilities and cities, even attacked Mecca, if I recall. We're not talking about them launching attacks on military targets to try to deter Saudi military operations or military operations against the UAE. They're intentionally targeting civilians with sophisticated military hardware, drones, ballistic missiles, things of that nature. And yet this is action that's being condoned by the Biden administration.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, anyway, we'll hope that, maybe with some of the recent events that it may place a little bit of pressure on the administration to reconsider its approach to the Houthis. But, I'd say, I know we don't give out awards to terrorist groups, but they're like the most improved player over like I mean, they've upped their game, and I'd say they're one to watch. I don't want to call them JV, to borrow from another terrorist snafu, right? This is not a JV team any longer. These guys are varsity, and we really do need to, figure out ways to neutralize. Again, a lot of people think Yemen doesn't matter. I think it's a bigger issue. It's about how much power Iran wields. And sort of how we deal with terrorist issues within the U.S. bureaucracy. And right now it looks like a failed test case.
Yeah, John, I would say the Houthis have earned their spot on the varsity jihadist team, terrorist team.
Yeah.
So they
like fifth man, maybe fourth.
Yeah. No, it might be a second or third line player, right? The grinder line, but they're there. They've earned that spot. They certainly they made their mark on the international jihadist world. I think we'll move on to the Iraqi militias right now. I think that's a logical step, and then we'll finish off with Hamas and with Hezbollah, the premier guys, and then we'll move on to Iran's support quickly to Al Qaeda and the Taliban. The Iraqi militias. This is, I've felt that this is sort of the untold story in all of this. We look at the impact of Hezbollah. It's recruited from a population in Lebanon that's about 4 or 5 million, and about 60 or what is it, like 40, 50, 60% Shia. Let's call it,
a slight majority.
Yeah, it's a slight majority. Yeah. So let's just call it half, right? So you're talking 2 million or so to recruit from.
But don't forget, there's Sunnis and then also Christians. So it's like a third.
Okay.
But it's, I think, a little bit more. I believe we can look it up. But
yeah, we're talking in the 1 point something million of Shia to recruit from. You have Iraq is a country of about 36 million, give or take, estimated to be about 60% Shia. Let's call it 50. So we're looking around 18 to 20 million Shia to recruit from. Iran used Hezbollah to help build the Iraqi militias in the same vein, to mirror what Hezbollah is. Hezbollah operatives, the U.S. military detained them while it was inside of Iraq. They were training, arming, funding, recruiting. And it's not just one militia now. We're talking multiple militias. Several of them are actually listed as foreign terrorist organizations. 2 of them are Asib al-Haq, or the League of the Righteous, and the other one is aptly named Hezbollah Brigades, or Kataib Hezbollah. These are organizations that, ironically, the U.S. supported while they were fighting the Islamic State from 2014 to 2019. The U.S. military essentially acted as the air. These units were they're organized under what's known as the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMF, as it's called. This is the grouping militias. The Iraqi parliament made it an official security branch that that answers directly to Iraq's prime minister. I believe this is set up to be, it's analogous to the Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. You have the same structure there. These militias, leaders, they've said that they would, if ordered by the Grand Ayatollah of Iran to overthrow the Iraqi government, they would gladly do so. They've basically sworn allegiance to Iran's leader. This is a major concern. You have a wide recruiting base. These are groups that are very good at recruiting, very good at propaganda, slick videos. They are largely, if not almost wholly, responsible for defeating the Islamic State. They were on the vanguard. They were the frontline forces when the Iraqi security forces collapsed. They prevented the collapse of Baghdad. I think this is
that's, by the way, why they've been welcomed into the into the government structure.
Yeah, exactly.
From the perspective of some Iraqis, they've earned their spot. The problem is, as you know, they answer to Iran at the end of the day. They don't answer to the Iraqi government, and that's the real concern, right? There's a kind of a dual loyalty issue, a conflict within, and it's allowed Iraq to succumb to Iranian influence beyond, I think, what anybody ever envisioned.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one weakness of this is that there's multiple militias. Now, they seem to be collegiate, the leaders, right? But they don't all report. If these militias were actually organized into that, Popular Mobilization Forces is sort of an umbrella organization, right? Think of it as a command, but it's a loose command. These organizations, Kataib Hezbollah operates under its leader, follows its leader. Asib al-Haq follows its leader, Mahdi Army, or whatever it's called today, Promise Day Brigade, or whatever Muqtada al-Sadr wants to call it. Now, he's not part of the PMF, but it's just another militia that's supported by the Iranians on the down low. If these guys could ever organize and truly integrate, you would have a very formidable force that, and I think this is something that countries like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, they should be very, very concerned about what's emanating from Iraq. And I think this is just one of these untold stories. It's just not understood. And you're just curious about your opinion on that, John.
No, I think that's right. I think that, again, getting to kind of why we left, or why we're leaving the Middle East, it's the PMF or the PMU, Popular Mobilization Unit. It's the other way people describe it. They've kind of overtaken the country, Iran, through basically a combination of hard and soft power, and just by wielding the Shiite population that has its sort of sectarian loyalties, if you will. We've watched Iraq slip through our hands, and I have to say it's incredibly frustrating. I think it is probably one of the most important underreported stories out of the Middle East is the extent to which many Hezbollah, many Houthis have sprouted up all across Iraq and into Syria. I think there will be sovereignty issues. There already are sovereignty issues relating to Iraq, how they're going to keep control over their territory when you have these, essentially, these militias that may not want to be governed, may not actually accept the government of Iraq as the ultimate address to where they must answer. So there is a huge problem brewing there, and we've seen, by the way, that these militias have been used from time to time in smuggling operations on behalf of the regime, but also military operations as well, targeting Americans, targeting others in the region. So we've got a huge potential problem brewing. It's already a problem in and of itself, but it can mushroom. And the question is, what does Iran want out of this? How does it plan to wield it? And that might be actually a good moment to just look at what has been happening in Syria. A lot of these, similar Shiite militias are helping Iran move weaponry across the Middle East, and primarily with the destination of Hezbollah. But we're talking about, precision-guided munitions parts, precision-guided munitions in whole, and also just establishing military centers of operation throughout Syria, not just, as a means of gaining a foothold in the country to defend against Sunni jihadists or, those that are trying to topple the Assad regime, but also to prepare for a war. You can kind of get a sense that a cordon is being drawn around that border with Israel, and they're trying to move more and more of these irregular troops in a way that could threaten Israel. Now, the Israelis, by the way, have carried out over the last 7, 8, 9 years, they've carried out thousands of strikes, some attributed, some not, all targeting Iranian assets, whether that's, things that have been smuggled, individuals that are operating. We've seen some senior commanders killed, but it is this remarkable shadow war that, again, you want to talk about an unreported story. That's a big one. The Israelis call it the war between wars, WBW. And the goal is just to try to weaken their enemy as much as possible before the next major round. But you look at kind of what's happening, the amount of munitions that have been used, the number of targets struck, it looks like a flat out war. It's just amazing that it hasn't spilled over, but it is absolutely one to watch. I don't know have you ever seen anything quite like this in terms of the volume involved?
No, I haven't, John. And I think that a big reason is because Syria has just become a free-for-all, right? It's literally, Assad, I think, given his choices, he wouldn't accept the Russian and the Iranian support, but his survival is completely dependent on it. And he's so weak that he really can't respond any longer to these Israeli incursions, these primarily airstrikes, be it either drone or manned vehicles. And also I've seen some missile strikes, things of that nature, targeting as you noted, this war between the war. I've never quite seen, I mean, the only thing I could kind of think of that might be analogous would be like U.S. operations in like Laos and Cambodia against the North Vietnamese, where you had this sort of shadow war going on between two different groups in a third party country. Not that Assad isn't a supporter of Hezbollah, but I think he'd rather at this point in time probably wouldn't like missiles raining down on his military installations. And, it's just another headache for him to deal with. And you alluded to this, and I just want to be very clear about this. Iraqi militias are operating inside of Syria. I mean, some of these militias have just literally, they partitioned off, renamed themselves, and just operate within Syria and are operating alongside Hezbollah. We've seen members of these militias, Hezbollah brigades and Asib al-Haq and others, being killed inside of Syrian territory during these operations. So, it's the shadow war between the war is really, to me, is the best way to look at it. This is all happening in the open, but it's completely dark. I don't think anyone really understands what's happening, or the average person really doesn't understand the scope and scale of this war between the war that's occurring in Syria.
Yeah. And I think the Israelis, to a certain extent, are probably the only ones standing in the way of Iran and what's been traditionally been described as, the land bridge or the Shiite crescent, where the Iranians are able to establish, physical presence stretching from Western Iran through Iraq, through Syria into Lebanon. And, the Israelis are really the only ones capable and willing to disrupt whatever this thing is shaping up to be. It's for that reason that I think they should be getting American support. I think it's been tacit support. But again, no one talks about it. No one wants to draw attention to it. And so here you got, you sort of have this war that drags on. It didn't slow during the COVID crisis. It just, if anything, it just seems like it keeps escalating. And by the way, even extends beyond places like that, where the Israelis and the Iranians have been duking it out on the high seas, cyber. This is spilling over and getting bigger. It's a fascinating phenomenon to observe.
Yeah. And, you mentioned that nobody wants to talk about it. Obviously, the U.S. doesn't want to mention Israel's role in conducting operations in foreign countries. Neither does the Israelis. Don't want to advertise that they're operating inside Syria all that much. The Iranians can't admit what they're doing. Hezbollah doesn't want to admit what it's doing. Nobody, and Assad doesn't want to admit that that he's a weak, propped up leader where, third parties are fighting a war on his territory. So it's the perfect storm for it being a silent war, so to speak. There was one more thought I had about this, and this just popped in my head. It's not really a crafted thought. I'm curious what you think, but is this a net positive or a net negative for the Israelis? It's almost like this is a continuation of war on its doorstep here. Is this just more of the same, that some of the battlefront has shifted from southern Lebanon into Syria? Is the threat, the way I look at it is the threat is increasing. There's just no way to see it with the involvement of the militias. We're just seeing, we now have like an active bridge from Iran through Iraq into Syria, to arm Hezbollah. If I'm the Israelis, I'm very concerned about what's happening here.
Yeah. And I'd say actually that's a perfect segue to, I guess, our second to last topic today, which is, just Hezbollah. Yes. And the reason why I think there's real concern in Israel is because Hezbollah's got right now, according to the estimates that I've heard, several hundred PGMs in its possession, which has been a lot of what this activity has been about for Iran. It's been about smuggling this advanced weaponry into Lebanon so that its most effective and deadly proxy can arm itself in ways that Israel may not be able to defend against. I mean, just to be clear, when we talk about PGMs, precision guided munitions, I don't believe, correct me if I'm wrong in the Sunni space, I've never seen a non-state actor / terrorist organization acquire precision guided munitions in this way. Munitions that can evade air defenses and munitions that can hit within 5 to 10 yards of their intended target, right? Incredibly dangerous when you think about, Hezbollah's ability to hit, the nuclear reactor in southern Israel or the chemical plant in the town of Haifa, which is in Israel's north, just as two examples that could create catastrophic attacks. But I mean, Bill, I'll ask you, have you ever seen a terrorist organization with this capability, right? It's always been a state actor.
Yeah, this is getting into the realm. This is where Hezbollah is crossing over into being, and look, they essentially control or wield enormous influence within the Lebanese government, right? It's essentially is becoming a state actor here. And yeah, to answer your question though, no, I've not seen Al-Qaeda, I've not seen the Islamic State wielding sophisticated weapons of this nature. The closest thing I've seen is anti-tank missiles that have been sent to so-called rebels in Syria, and they just hand them over to Al-Qaeda's branch there, and they're being used. But that's it. Not to the degree of what Hezbollah is acquiring. And this is, not just a concern for Israel; it's a concern for the U.S. and its interests overseas. Hezbollah helped build an organization that killed over 600 soldiers inside of Iraq. They gleefully did this. Iran provided bounties in both Iraq and in Afghanistan to kill American soldiers. They armed, trained, funded, and equipped and provided safe haven for terror groups. And Hezbollah is, a premier terrorist organization that, its acquisition of precision guided missiles should strike fear in the heart of everyone and anyone who cares about peace in the Middle East.
Yeah. And, I would take it a step further though, too, is, the violation of what we would only be able to describe as the norm in the provision of this weaponry, the proliferation of this weaponry. If this becomes something that is, more commonplace, you could see, and by the way, and we can use this as a jump point to the next spot, but we've seen, that Iran and Al-Qaeda have cooperated. We've seen the interconnectivity between Hezbollah, Iran, Al-Qaeda, and other Sunni groups. So if you can transfer it to one group, what's to say you can't transfer it to another and to another? Now, all of a sudden, all of America's asymmetric, enemies could potentially be armed with these sophisticated weapons. That is a very different scenario. Part of the reason why I think America has been nominally successful in combating a lot of these terrorist groups is because they're operating with very basic, rudimentary weapons, right? They're flying planes into buildings because they don't have the weapons. They're carrying out suicide bombings because they don't have the weapons. This is, what a lot of people would call weapons of the weak. You're now looking at a far more sophisticated arsenal, which is something that really, I'm shocked personally that we haven't seen more attention on this, right? That we haven't seen more attention in Washington about stopping this process now, calling it out publicly, challenging the Iranians, hauling them before the UN Security Council for that matter. Not that that does anything, but, at least acknowledging and exposing what's happening here because of what could happen down the line.
Yeah. And the whole point there is then you would have to, but then what does that do to negotiations in the nuclear realm? Then we have to recognize that Iran may not be a friendly country that is doing things that are nasty. Before we jump into Iran's support for Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, Sunni jihadist groups, we'll talk about another Sunni jihadist group here, Hamas, which obviously operates in Palestinian territories. Iran has supported Hamas for 3-4 decades now.
1988.
Yeah. So well, you do the math, folks. In your book, Gaza Conflict 2021, you note that Hamas escaped last summer's war with Israel without taking any heat for being an Iranian proxy. How is this even possible, John? What has happened in the world that Iran can support a group that launches a war against Israel and takes zero heat for it?
So the answer actually, I'd say, tracks back to that old adage. You give a man a fish, and he'll come back the next day and ask for another. You teach a man a fish, and he'll be able to feed himself for the rest of his life. This is basically what the Iranians have done with Hamas. They provided them with the know-how to create their own rockets and projectiles. They have helped them develop tunnel building and construction technology. They have helped them acquire drones and operate them. But you don't see them as intimately involved with the day-to-day of the organization's operations the way you do with a lot of these Shiite militias, certainly with Hezbollah, where there's kind of an acknowledged high-level relationship. With Hamas, you have various centers of decision-making. So you got, the Gaza Strip, you got Turkey, you got Qatar, you got Iran, and all these different leaders all come together and reach a consensus about war, about, ceasefires, about training, about weapons, etc. Iran's over the years, don't get me wrong, the Iranians have provided hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in assistance and a huge amount of training and help with commandos and frogmen and all these things that we've already discussed. But they are able to do so now from arm's length. And so, there are people out there today who I think very wrongly assert that, hey, sure, Iran helps them, but, it's not like, they're not they don't control Hamas. I think that's a distinction without too much of a difference at this point. If you've helped to develop a lethal terrorist organization over the course of, 30 something years, that should be enough. And if you're a journalist covering this story, shame on you for not even acknowledging that in your reporting during these flare-ups, in the Gaza Strip. And so that was actually one of the reasons why I wrote the book. I was so incredibly frustrated with the media coverage of the war. Look, I don't care if you want to criticize Israel for settlement construction or whatever, but you're going to ignore the role of Iran as a sponsor of terrorism in a conflict between a terrorist group and an American ally. It just, to me, seems really off. So anyway, that's kind of how they were able to get away with it. Unfortunately, I think they're going to be able to continue to get away with it because there'll be a fifth war, sixth war, seventh war in the Gaza Strip. We expect those to flare up every couple of years. Iran likes it that way, and that's what will happen.
Yeah, it keeps things on edge. It's certainly, it keeps Israel on the defensive. It keeps them focused on the near enemy, and it's less pressure the Israelis can put on the Iranians on their home turf. And when it comes to
I like to say they love fighting Israel to the last Palestinian.
Absolutely, yeah. No, they love fighting the United States and Iraq to the last Iraqi Shia. It's their love of supporting someone else's jihadist. I think that when it comes to the press too, I think this narrative has taken hold that the Israelis are responsible for this, the occupation narrative, the Palestinians have just become the cause celeb in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict amongst the press. There's just, and like the Israelis have made mistakes. They've done things that I don't agree with, but at the end of the day, it is a democracy. It is a free country that is not perfect, just as we here in the United States are not perfect. If our listeners know that we're not going to defend the United States when it makes mistakes, but we actually have the freedom to do so, to criticize our government. You won't have that freedom to do so in Hamas-run occupied Palestinian territories or inside of Iran and things of that nature. And that's why we ultimately do come to the defense of countries like Israel and the United States. Let's, we're going long, John. Two more quick topics and then we'll call it a day.
It's a marathon.
I know. Sorry. I told you to be quick and here we are. Right. But once you start looking,
I like you.
It's a testament. I like you. It's a testament to Iran's support for terrorist organizations, right?
No, you could spend days talking about this. We actually covered a lot of ground pretty quickly, to be honest.
Yeah, we got a little bit more to cover, and there's a lot we didn't. Iran's support for terror groups in the Gulf region, right? In Saudi Arabia and in the UAE and other countries, right? There's small militias there that they support, and their activities in places like South America and Africa. We could go on and on, but we'll round this out with Iran's support for both Al Qaeda and for the Taliban. We'll start off with Al Qaeda. Look, there's been numerous designations of Al Qaeda leaders who are known to be sheltering and operating from Iran, including that designation that details the so-called, this is in quote, put the words special deal in quotes. That's from a Treasury designation in, I believe it was 2011. That noted that Iran and Al Qaeda have a deal. They have an agreement that Al Qaeda leaders can shelter there as long as Al Qaeda itself doesn't attack Iranian interests inside of Iran and try and keep it to a low point outside of Iran. And this deal is now 11 years old. And lest you think that this was something from the Bush administration, again, it was 2011 under President Obama. The deal was mentioned, reiterated during the Trump administration, and the most recent country reports on terrorism from 2021. So that's last year terrorism for the past year, also notes that this special deal is still in effect and senior Al Qaeda leaders are operating in Iran. And even the United Nations Sanctions and Monitoring Team has noted that Iran is sheltering top Al Qaeda leaders. What do you make of this, John? Why is Iran getting in bed? I mean, look, I know the answer, but I want to hear your opinion on this. Why is Iran get in bed with groups like Al Qaeda, which they do have fundamental differences with, and they also get in bed with groups like the Taliban? Is this tactical, strategic, or a combination of both?
It's all of the above, man. I mean, look, this is enemy of my enemy stuff, right? At the end of the day. But by the way, I mean, you didn't even get into some of it. I mean, I know you know all this, but maybe for our listeners, first of all, the Treasury Department's been putting out designations of Al Qaeda operatives that have been based in Iran since the mid 2000s, and it's been consistently produced by Treasury Departments of both Democratic and Republican administrations. This is bipartisan. It's fact. There are, by the way, some who are out there like Peter Bergen who talk about this arrangement as, these people are under house arrest. I think that is a very generous way of describing this relationship, where, you have the family of Osama bin Laden, they're getting together for weddings in Iran, right, over in years past, right? So this has been a pretty cozy relationship that's existed. And of course, we can even go back to the 9/11 Commission report, which notes that some of the hijackers traveled or trained in Iran, and that Iran likely had something to do with this. Of course, Iran had some things to do with the 1998 Twin Embassy bombings. I mean, this goes back a long way. And I think, there is, something that needs to be understood in general, which is that, a lot of people make a big deal about the Shiite Sunni sectarian divide. And that is a thing in a lot of the Arab world, in a lot of the Muslim world. But as far as Al Qaeda is concerned, they don't care if you're Sunni or Shiite, as long as you are waging their war. And they have found common cause. Hamas is a Sunni terrorist organization that they've worked with. They worked with the Sunni regime in Sudan for many years. This has been a consistent theme with the Iranians. They are happy to work with any violent actor who is willing to work with them. And so this is something that I suspect we're going to continue to see in some shape or form. It is kind of amazing, though, when you think about that. It certainly looks, the overall trend would make it seem like the Sunni terrorist pace has dropped and the Shiite has grown over the years. I'm not sure that's true, but I do think that we see more and more of that cooperation, perhaps behind the scenes, that may be fomenting both.
Yeah, and on that last point, I think with the Shia side of it, it's just been more visible, right? We've seen a lot of, they've had great success. The Houthis in Yemen, the militias in Syria, what's happened in Iraq, right? We're seeing,
you almost said that like Borat. Great success.
The great success. Yes, but again, the Sunni Jihad has had great success as well. They've taken over Afghanistan. Jihad is, dare I say, exploding in Western and Sub-Saharan Africa. So they've had great success. Again, they've had good success in those theaters. But yeah, it's a good point. And, John, what point when these two groups are operating They're cooperating. They have a secret deal that's been in effect. Now we can point back to 11 years, but they've been working together for at least 3 decades plus. What point does a tactical relationship become a strategic relationship? And on Peter Bergen, who I often disagree with, the idea that they're under loose house arrest, that's not what the Treasury isn't characterizing it like that, for one. And two, when the Israelis assassinated Abu Muhammad al-Masri, who was al-Qaeda's second in command in Tehran, he decided not to bring his IRGC bodyguard with him that day. And he was hanging out in Tehran with his daughter. And by the way, I'm not making this up. You could read this in the New York Times if you question my sources. That's the reporting on this. There is no reason to think that this is not true. We know that this is happening. You mentioned the wedding. Osama bin Laden's son, Hamza bin Laden, is married. You see senior al-Qaeda leaders at that wedding. They're not under house arrest. It's not even a loose house arrest. They're hanging out in a hall. My guess is the IRG is hanging out outside, making sure that nobody interferes with Hamza's grand wedding.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm sure they're also trying to prevent, these guys from attacking things that they don't want to see hit. So, there's a bit of a symbiotic thing happening there. But yeah, it's a strategic relationship for them now. It's one of the weapons that they have at their disposal. Perhaps they can't control it as much as they might be able to control, Hezbollah or some of the militias that we talked about, Saib al-Haq or Kataib Hezbollah, in Iraq, or even the Houthis. But they still have the ability to wield them in some shape or form, much in the same way that they're able to with Hamas. And so, I think we found that over the years that there's really, there are very few terrorist organizations that Iran won't try to get close to, as the leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world. We saw, fingerprints of Iran and Afghanistan, for that matter, right? I mean, this is something we see worldwide.
Yeah, and look, Iran doesn't need to direct al-Qaeda. All it needs to do is ensure that al-Qaeda doesn't interfere with with Iranian interests. Al-Qaeda has its own operations and its own plans and its own theaters that sometimes conflict with the Iranians, but often do not. And just by allowing them to have safe haven and providing them support and allowing to survive and thrive, that is just as important as providing money and direction and other things. Let's move on to the Taliban. I just recently, it was late October, I testified in a case called Cabrera v. Iran. So this was family, U.S. soldiers and civilians who were killed or wounded in Iraq. So if they were killed, the families are suing. If they were alive, they themselves were plaintiffs on the case. They're suing Iran because Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism. So the U.S. law allows American citizens to seek compensation. We saw this with 9/11 and other families and other cases. When I first started this, I knew the case and started the research. I knew that Iran supported the Taliban, but I always assumed that it was more of a peripheral thing. I would have described Pakistan's support for the Taliban as being primary and Iranian support being tertiary, right? That they would support groups along the border, the sheltering of the al-Qaeda leaders, they'd say Taliban leaders would get safe haven, things of that. But I didn't think of it as being an all-encompassing thing. And then we did the research. Then I really got into the research. Some of the things we got was declassified documents from the U.S. military intelligence reports that were detailing ties between Iran and senior Taliban leaders who have been designated. It's very clear. The Iranians provided weapons. They provided training. They provided safe haven, and they provided financial support to Taliban subgroups throughout the country, including the Haqqani network. We even traced Iranian support to a cell with inside of Kabul And the cell is known by the U.S. military as the Kabul Attack Network. This is a cell that was the Taliban, which included the Haqqanis and groups like Al-Qaeda, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Islamic Movement Uzbekistan, Movement of Taliban in Pakistan. They all pooled their resources in order to launch more effective attacks in the capital of Kabul. And often the targets were U.S. soldiers, U.S. military, NATO military installations, soft targets like hotels where foreigners would be. So this alliance, this Kabul Attack Network was a force multiplier for the Taliban, right? They can launch more spectacular attacks. And these are attacks we've seen, like overrunning the Serena Hotel with people going in and clearing floor to floor, killing people and launching suicide attacks, things of that nature. And they tracked IRG support to a known Taliban commander who was a known leader within the Kabul Attack Network. And this is the support now, why would Iran support the Taliban? They had disagreements over Taliban support the Taliban executing Shia inside of Afghanistan in the 1990s. There were conflicts between the two, over this. I mean, the Iranians tend to, look at the Shia in foreign countries as being under their protection. Well, and the answer is quite simple when you look at it. Iran's interests were driving the U.S. out of Afghanistan. So they wanted to kill and wound American soldiers in order to drive up the price for U.S. presence in Afghanistan. Why does Iran want the U.S. out of Afghanistan? They didn't want the U.S. on their borders in any way, shape, or form. They feared U.S. interference. I mean, I don't know if you recall, John, but I want to say was it a decade ago or it was a couple of years ago where a sophisticated U.S. surveillance plane, I believe it was unmanned, crashed in Iranian. I think it was right on.
It crashed in Afghanistan, and then the Iranians came up with their own version of it.
Yes, right? Exactly. No, I thought it crashed on the Iranian side of the border. Am I right?
I thought it was in Afghanistan.
Well, they recovered it, right? Like so, right. Yeah, and they're always fearful of the U.S. spying on them from Afghanistan, but more importantly, being present there in order to conduct operations inside of Iran. And so they team up with the Taliban, who they may not have great interest with. But look, that Iran-Al-Qaeda relationship facilitates Iran's support for the Taliban. They are able to work with one group. They could work with another. So yeah. Iran.
But I'll tell you, it's all about trying to undermine the U.S.-led order in the region, yes. Right? It's about aligning with those that agree that the United States-led order in the region is not in their interest. They want to see some kind of revolutionary, violent overthrow of the U.S. By the way, it's been working. And, they found common cause with a number of these actors. And if you look, they're gaining that control. We talked about that crescent stretching across the Middle East. And by the way, you see their presence in places, I think you mentioned, like in Bahrain, you see, Iranian sort of partisans there, Iran-backed partisans. You see it in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. You see it, like I said, in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. They are expanding. They are growing. And they're trying to do it at the expense of the United States. And they're trying to do it while trying to acquire a nuclear weapon. You can see the full spectrum. I think we just, over the course of a fairly small amount of time, we've just kind of described that overall strategy for hegemony that the Iranians have. And, the crazy thing is it looks like the United States is ready to say yes to this approach, right? Here, have a lot of money. Here, have, a timeline for a nuke in a short amount of time. And by the way, no, we're not going to intervene in Yemen. We're actually going to leave the Houthis unlisted as a terrorist organization. So, go ahead, do what you want. I mean, you can kind of get a sense that, as the United States tires of the region, Iran is benefiting significantly.
John, I think that's an excellent observation and a great place to end this podcast. Do you agree?
Really uplifting too, right? I mean, just a real high note.
We really did end on a high note, but there's no way to discuss this topic and many of the topics we discussed without leading our listeners to near suicide. We can be depressing at times, but look, we Look, there was a time, John, where I was an eternal optimist in all this. I remember when you could fit the number of people in Washington who supported the surge in Iraq in a phone booth. And I was one of them because having traveled to Iraq and embedding with Iraqis, I understood they hated the Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And there was an opportunity to work. And the surge did work until the rug was pulled out from under it. But, and the Obama administration withdrew in 2011. We had a chance. We squandered it. And I think it's all been downhill from there. It's unfortunate, but this is the state of play. We get tactical wins like the U.S. killing a leader of the Islamic State just last week. That's a good kill, but does it end the Islamic State? We do small things well, but we've lost in my opinion, we've lost our will. We've lost our political will, particularly to wage these wars or to oppose our enemies and adversaries. And look, I don't think this ends with the Middle East, with Iran or in Afghanistan with the Taliban. When you're not willing to fight enemies that are committed enemies, what chance do we have in Ukraine? What chance would we have against a Chinese incursion in Taiwan? This is where this is what really, I would say, keeps me awake at night. I realize this is all very dark and depressing, but these are the concerns I have. And, I'm just going to leave it at that.
My advice, drink through it.
Yeah. Well, getting a little older, I can't drink like I used to, John. I mean, I can, but I think I shouldn't. But maybe I should. Maybe I should. All right, John. Thank you very much for joining us. It was a fantastic conversation.
Hey, my pleasure, always.
Yeah, no, it's great. We needed this roundup of what has happened on the Shia side of the aisle for the last, I'd say, 8 months. We've been focusing primarily on the Sunni threat and specifically on Afghanistan. And it is absolutely a pleasure for me to talk to something that isn't Afghanistan. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's episode of that's episode 60 of Generation Jihad. Later this week, I'll be talking with Edmund Fitton Brown, the coordinator of the United Nations Security Council Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team. They just issued a report, a lot of good information out in there. So Edmund, who's been a frequent guest of this program, he's going to join us. I always look forward to speaking to him. Just a reminder, you can find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review. Leave a positive review if you can. Thanks again, and we'll see you all again soon.